My name is Zach McCauley. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Demand Drive, and thank you to all of those who are here live. Yes, we will be sending out the on-demand version to everybody, including yourselves. And before we get started, I just want everybody to quickly make a quick note of how many sales qualified leads or opportunities you are currently generating through your sales development channel. Ballpark it if necessary. I imagine most of you don't have that number in front of you or on top of mind. But identify how many qualified leads are coming through each quarter. Identify how much you estimate each of those SQLs or opportunities to be worth. So base that on your conversion rates and your average sales price, and then multiply those figures. So now that resulting number, I'd like you to keep that in mind when I mention any metrics throughout this webinar, because that will help you, again, in a general estimation sense, it will help you quantify the revenue that you're foregoing should any of you out there have closing reps cold calling, or even have an SDR team who simply doesn't execute some of the processes that we will go over. So to get started, I do want to provide some context into where these best practices and where these metrics are coming from. So as the Director of Marketing here at Demand Drive, I have quite a unique perspective and unique background within the sales development space. So I do head the marketing here at Demand Drive, and part of that role is to enable our sales team to be successful. So that means running metrics, running reports and dashboards, and truly understanding what is helping our closing team succeed. It also means that I manage the sales development function here for Demand Drive generated business. So I'm constantly working very closely with our closing reps, with our SDRs, and making sure that they have everything they need and continue to refine their processes in order to be successful. I also have about 30% of my day dedicated to the operations team here at Demand Drive. So any of our clients who we onboard for about a week, a kickoff week is what we describe it as, to really understand their sales process, their current sales development process if they have it, diagnose any of their inefficiencies, understand the shortcomings, both from their sales team's perspective and also their marketing team's perspective. So I'm having conversations on a very frequent basis with anywhere ranging from very small startups like AJ mentioned up to global enterprise companies. So there's a lot of aggregation in terms of metrics and experience in which I myself am exposed to, as well as Demand Drive as a whole, which where these best practices come from. And this webinar in particular actually is a result of an email I sent probably maybe a year ago, and you can see it here. The headline or the subject in which I had sent this email was that your sales reps probably stink at cold calling, and here's why. So very similar title, obviously, and it was very interesting in which and you'll see a graphic here. I will actually send out that graphic afterwards with the recording, so don't strain your eyes trying to see it. But what I was really trying to get at here was, if you have closing reps cold calling, they're probably not the most effective resource in which you could have dedicated to that function. And I got a tremendous amount of reception on that, a great deal of feedback, mostly good, some bad, lots of well, I wouldn't say lots, but some replies back in which there was some anger, your reps stink, not mine. You are capitalized, not your. But I thought that was a great topic then to really discuss and drill into educating why closing reps are just not the best resource or the most efficient resource to be dedicated to the sales development function. So without further ado, let's dive into the 5 reasons why closing reps stink at sales development. And the first one here is time. So this is a very, very obviously basic concept. Closing reps and quota carrying reps simply have a finite amount of time throughout their day. Yes, they work heavy hours, they work long hours, but that will also lead to ebbs and flows, and sales development in particular is a process, it's a channel, it's a piece of the sales team that really thrives and needs consistency. Predictable Revenue is a very aptly named book. I'm sure most of you have heard of it, have read it. Very basically goes written by Aaron Ross, who had headed the sales development function and really created in very very detail the sales development process that we use today. That serious decisions, in particular, who we follow, our processes, and really the best practices across tech. So in order to avoid these volatile ebbs and flows, and that might be at the end of a quarter, if your particular industry peaks in certain months, your buying cycles are only a few months throughout the year. These sales reps simply will not dedicate a consistent amount of time per day, per week, per month, per quarter in order to generate a clear and consistent pipeline. When week A, they may be generating their own leads, they might be cold calling, and once they kind of fill up their own personal pipeline, they're really going to work on closing those deals. And then a few weeks later, all of a sudden they have done well, they do what they're paid to do, and that's close business, and now their pipeline is empty and it starts all over again. So that is one thing that you definitely need to avoid, and in order to have a predictable revenue stream, is to avoid those ebbs and flows that come with closing reps generating their own leads. And now, one thing that I hear all the time from all of our clients, I had just seen something from Serious Decisions a few days ago. Closing reps are not always closing. I know ABC, always be closing, is the very old, and for some of us, saying, but well over 50% of sales managers say that their reps are spending too much time doing things that are not selling. That could be things like researching accounts, sourcing contacts, data entry, handling scopes of work, handling contracts, account management or customer success, even as simple as identifying which pieces of collateral to send a prospect. And that doesn't even get to cold calling, which in itself is not necessarily the act of selling. Selling is a piece of it, but is not the whole piece of sales development. So when sales reps are doing all these things and not even approaching the cold calling aspect, there's just not enough time in the day. So that brings us to the next point, incentives and goals. Now, sales reps are by nature a very incentive-driven lot, right? So very simply, closing reps are incentivized to close business, and what that means is, when reps prioritize their day, when, like I said, they have a finite amount of time to get their work done, they're always going to focus in on what's going to get them paid, and that is what makes them very successful. But it's also what will contribute to the ebbs and flows, and at the end of the day, things like sales development, lead nurturing, any piece of the sales development process will fall off the table and then be picked back up when it's convenient for that sales rep because they no longer have a piece of business to close. And that is simply the goal of every call for them as well. So if the goal of every call for a closing quota-carrying rep is to generate revenue right then and there, there's simply an inefficiency. And I say this, so the majority, and I say this within the context of the enterprise space, and that does not necessarily include very transactional solutions or the small business portion of a sales unit, which probably has inside sales teams who cold call, convert, sell, very lower average sales price pieces of software to the manager level. Inside sales rep can call a manager and convert with the manager's credit card on the phone. So that is not necessarily the scope with which we're talking here. But the majority of closed business will have a sales cycle anywhere from a few months to a few years, and you're simply not going to sell that person on your first cold call. And when that closing sales rep tries to do that, instead of executing, your sales development best practices, your elevator pitch, you're trying to identify with probing questions what exactly the prospect could benefit from, the sales rep will instead product dump. They will really get into their pitch as if there was a slide deck in front of them, and because that's exactly what they're used to and exactly what they're good at, and it's exactly what they're trained to do. And sales development reps on the flip side are simply better at cold calling prospects and getting them interested in your product by asking probing questions, by understanding that this person is being called out of the blue, or maybe as a part of the call plan or part of the email plan, may have a vague idea who you are, but don't necessarily understand what value you can bring to them right away. And that skill set is unique to itself. For example, we had done a webinar on sales development training and ramping and building a sales development team. And one of the analogies in which we talked about was that, people will often say that you should always wear your seatbelt even if you're running an errand, because most accidents will happen within a few miles of your house. And the reason being is you actually spend most of your time only within a few miles of your house, even if you're traveling across the country, or if you're going to pick up your laundry and it's right down the block. The majority of your driving is done within those few miles. And that's very similar to sales development. Most calls and most conversations will happen and either be converted or not converted on the first 30 seconds of a phone call, which includes your hook and your elevator pitch and things that are very relevant to the sales development team, but maybe kind of on the periphery of your closing reps. So the incentive of the rep who's cold calling and the goal of the call of the rep who's cold calling, it needs to be very specific. So you can incentivize your sales development team to have a certain number of quality conversations, to generate a certain number of leads, and to make sure the goal of their call is to educate this person and set them up for a more in-depth discovery call, as opposed to a closing rep who is simply trying to sell as fast and as quickly as possible. And that actually does lead to a nice segue of the next point, which is the training and process. So by nature, as I mentioned, sales development is a process-driven endeavor. Closing reps, by and large, simply do not, and this is sometimes by preference, experience, time constraints, as I mentioned, or a whole slew of other reasons, will not stick to the sales development process. And for those of you out there who are on the marketing side, I know there is a few of you who are nodding your head and simply understanding that sales reps want to be selling. There are things in the sales development process in which are not selling and are foregone and forgotten about your closing team. And one of the major components to sales development, and it's really the lifeblood of the channel, is the call plan. So on this graphic in front of you, what we call process follow-up. You have to have a metrics-based call plan, 8 to 10 touches. Make sure you are maximizing the connect rate, how many quality conversations a rep is having. And what we found is that, in order to maximize the chance you'll have of talking with a prospect, it is about 8 to 10 touches, and about 15% of those touches will lead to a quality conversation. And what closing reps tend to do is ad hoc prospecting. And we here list 2 touch points to connect with a prospect. But the reality is it ranges from 1 to 2. And I know that sounds like a small difference, but when it's extrapolated over a whole team of reps across an entire quarter, that's a lot of call activities in which are not being made. And as you can see and as I mentioned, I want you to pay attention to the metrics here. You will increase your sales development results, so your opportunities and sales qualified leads, by 12% if you implement the process properly with the sales development team. And that also leads to a component of that process, which is account mapping. And that's adding your contacts via phone, which is referrals, or working with the admin, going through your internal database, researching on LinkedIn or forums or wherever it may be applicable. And like I said, you can also incentivize your sales development team to do this, and simply won't matter enough for your closing reps to be incentivized by it. But they simply tend to rely on any referral that comes in via email or phone, and they're going to prioritize any inbound leads, any hot leads over this process. And this process is extremely beneficial. It will increase your sales qualified lead and your opportunity results by 25%. And we actually had done a few tests around this over the past 4 years. We have seen a very minimal change in this. This is a very time-tested and consistent method in which to increase your sales development results. So that brings me to the fourth reason that sales development should not be handled by closing reps, and that is priorities. So we kind of have talked about priorities, based on incentives, priorities based on time, but let's talk about priorities within your universe, right? Most sales reps who are quota carrying, they have experience. They've hopefully, likely been in your space for a decent amount of time, and with that experience comes a lot of great things, right? They can be, they can trust their gut, they can trust their instincts because they've had plenty of conversations, they've had deals be closed within your space and hopefully within your company. But that also does bring in something of a bias of prior assumptions. It brings in an account bias, and they'll stray from an ideal customer profile. They will stray from the call plan because they will say, I know this account, it's not worth it. However, it is a bit of a fallacy because they don't believe this account is a fit, yet their decision is based on a conversation they had 5 years ago with a prospect who is no longer there. And this is something that we see all the time. We work with sales reps who will mention, hey, by the way, don't call company XYZ. I know that they're using competitor X. And our reps will actually call in, identify that the person, a decision maker who had been a champion of competitor X is no longer there, and they are now evaluating. They're sending out an RFP or any sort of evaluation process. So you definitely need to eliminate any account bias in that way. And what this also does is create an inefficient lead prioritization, right? So during the sales development phase, prioritizing your leads is absolutely critical, and there's a number of ways to do it. You can use analytics to create a predictable lead model. You can do it based on your ideal customer profile. However it is that you do it, it's important to remember that reps do have this finite amount of time, and this means that leads that require multiple qualification calls, multiple discovery calls. They need to reschedule those very early connections, or they need to add contacts. These leads will become deprioritized for that sales rep. So again, they will stray from this ideal customer profile. They will stray from the initial lead priority because in their mind, the time benefit ratio just does not simply add up. And the third is, again, the goal of each call for a sales development rep is to qualify and generate leads as opposed to closing business. But let's take that a step further. If a prospect or an account is no longer qualified, the closing rep is, will understandably so, no longer be interested in that conversation. They want to get to their next conversation and start selling. But what sales development reps should be trained to do, and one of the more successful components to our programs that we have for our clients, is our reps gain intelligence, right? So when a lead is not qualified, or even if it's a nurture, it's just not sales ready, a sales development rep should still focus on the value of that account, which is compiling account intelligence, competitor intelligence, understanding what that buying structure, so who is the decision maker, who is the budget owner, who are the influencers, what competitor they're using, when is their sales cycle or evaluation period occurring, and on a macro scale, all this information should then be brought into a Salesforce or CRM, and which will eventually help refine and improve your sales development process going forward, and either validate or refine what you know about your market. And that's actually something I did skip a few minutes ago. So one of the pieces of the process, and we can list it under priorities, and it just won't be on the screen, is, as I mentioned before, closing reps spend a lot of time doing data entry, but the reality of the situation is, and for you marketing folks out there, I can already see and visualize the nets going up and down. Sales reps don't input everything into Salesforce. They don't input everything into your CRM. That will, whether it's this intelligence, whether it's your lead statuses, whether it's the dispositioning of qualified or disqualified leads, the data quality will suffer, and that will impact your marketing analysis. It will impact future marketing campaigns. It will impact your sales intelligence. It will impact the entire marketing and sales function from top of the funnel down to close. And that's something that simply needs to be done. It is not a fun activity for closing reps, or really anybody, but sales development reps can be either incentivized or held more accountable than a closing rep based on their position. So that will bring me to the last and fifth reason that sales development should not be handled by closing reps. And this is very similar to keeping up with the CRM, lead nurturing. What we call here, what we call two-way nurturing, is essentially a nurture mode as a sales development process. And what that means is typically what we see across the board is that if a lead is not sales ready, and this can be either determined by this, on the first cold call, it can be determined on the discovery call, when a sales development rep will hand over a lead to the closing rep, and the closing rep decides they're not sales ready, or anywhere in between. If a lead's not sales ready, it will be put into an automated nurturing campaign and will stay there until it hits a certain score. And at that point, the sales rep, the closing rep, will follow up and re-engage. And what we see is that that's simply not enough. And if you execute what we call two-way nurturing, which is having the sales development rep focus in on things like really understanding when the buying cycle occurs, keeping that relationship going, making sure you check in 25% of the way through that difference, right? So if a sales development rep cold calls prospect X in July, prospect X says we're not evaluating until January, make sure the sales development rep will follow up in September. Make sure that that prospect is still on time and on schedule to evaluate in January. And then they'll call again in the end of November to make sure that they're still on schedule. And lo and behold, prospect X says, well, we actually have leftover budget, and we have a pain that you would directly be able to alleviate. Let's hop on a call and let's spend this money and evaluate before the end of the year. Now, that lead may or may not be addressed and called if it was just simply left in the automated nurturing. And like I say, as you can see on the screen, that leads to a 7% increase. And we actually had done this with a previous client in which they had about 500 leads that were determined by their closing reps to not be sales ready. We took that list. It was still in their automated nurturing system. We took that list and actually generated leads and dispositioned nearly half of those. and we're able to identify, okay, here is the set in which are purchasing sooner than thought. Here is the set in which is buying in the next 6 months, and here is the set in which is still in that true nurture mode. Now, none of these leads actually made it to the threshold, a lead score in which a closing rep would have engaged with them. So that example, very extreme, and the percentage there was much higher than probably what you will see, but what you should see is somewhere in and around 7%. So that is the end of today's webinar, and there are a few questions that did come in. I know we're pushing on time here, so I'll actually just get to one which I see a few different versions of, and that is, what do you define as transactional? So I had mentioned earlier that if your solution and your pricing strategy is on the transactional part, piece of the spectrum, sales development team may not be the most efficient way to go ahead and generate leads and increase your funnel activity. And what we define as and there's really no fine line between transactional and enterprise, as I'm sure you know. It's more of a gray area, but what we see, to kind of ballpark it for you, anywhere between 30 to 50,000 per year as your average sales price is that gray area. So anything below that, and this is actually let me try and provide you that caveat. This will depend on what your revenue goal is, what your sales qualified lead goal is, what your qualifying criteria is, and what you define as an opportunity. Depends on how large your closing sales force is. It depends on a lot of different variables. But generally speaking, good rule of thumb is that anywhere from 30K to 50K per year is kind of that threshold. And if it's below that, you kind of would have to definitely look at the cost per lead. Anything within that gray area or above is a good bet that you're highly paid. Keep that in mind. Highly paid sales reps in which they're spending their time doing things that are other than closing is not the most efficient way to generate leads. So there are a few other questions here. They're more marketing oriented, and I will follow up with those individuals individually, naturally. So if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email, zach.mccauley@demandrive.com, or give me a call at the number listed on your screen. But thank you so much for stopping by, and we hope to see you next time.